It's time for your weekly tutorials, and this week I'm going to be covering 5 tips on how to make the leg series feel better for you and for your body. So let's start with tip number 1. Tip number 1 for the leg series is to get cozy in the position. So usually when people first come into this position, the number 1 most common question, I get it every single week that we teach a move like this, is about this bottom hip digging into the ground and feeling uncomfortable. Now, I've experienced that as well. And what I do during this series is I simply adjust my body. So by bringing the bottom knee forward, sometimes bringing the bottom knee back, rolling around a little bit on the floor, you gotta find that spot, that sweet spot, where the hip bone is not just digging down to a point where it becomes painful. You may have to adjust several different times in this series, and that's okay. Today I want to show you something else. So this is a gardening knee pad that I've been using in the garden. You could use a pillow, you could use a lot of different things, but essentially anything with some cushion. If you want, you can place that underneath your hip so that when you sit down on it, you have a little bit of extra cushion. Another option would be to simply double over your mat so that way the hip has a little extra support on the floor. Tip number 2 is to actively lift your body weight up and away from the floor. So when you come into this position, it is not a resting position. If I start to let my body's weight sink down, I'm going to be sinking in the shoulder, and going back to tip number 1, there's going to be much more weight pressing downward and into this hip. So you'll end up feeling the hip more if you're letting your body weight sink. So it's important to note that this overall position is actually a very active move. In fact, it's quite similar to the idea of a side plank. So when you are here, it's not your body weight driving into the floor. Here I am sinking. Instead, it's the body weight lifting. So use the oblique, press out of the shoulder. Try to get a little bit lighter on that bottom hip. So again, you are actively working in this position and then trying to find the leg. Tip number 3, don't let this leg come up too high. So a lot of times people are trying to lift this leg up in order to work it. And the moment that this leg goes high, I already feel it right now, this area is really gonna start to cramp, especially if you have tight IT bands, which I would say 90% of us do, okay? So when you are here, get into position, get active, get lifted, get adjusted, and then just keep that toe really, really close to the floor. You don't have to try to lift the leg at all. The position will take care of the height of your leg. So let it extend, let it reach long, keep reaching long through the waist, and this is going to help make sure that you're not cramping up in that outer thigh. Tip number 4 is to do less. And I know that that sounds a bit counterintuitive to what you're used to hearing when you're working out, but here's the deal. This outer thigh area doesn't take much to fire up because, again, for most people it is so tight. So when you're working here, you don't have to try to squeeze extra. You don't have to try to kick the leg really big. You need to think about keeping it long and extended. Try to relax through the outer thigh, and then try to find your butt. Now, you're going to most be able to find your butt if you push your leg backwards just a smidge. So keep it low, press it back, and then try to squeeze your tushy when you're in this position. And the more that you grip through the glute, the less you will cramp into the outer thigh. So I say do less because usually you get there by relaxing into it, focusing on the setup form that we've already talked about, and then trying to push the leg backwards to grab a little bit of glute. Get that before you do any of the leg sweeping. Tip number 5 is to stay small and stable in your leg sweep. So when you are doing your leg sweep, the leg doesn't have to come very far forward in order for this exercise to work. Especially if you have tight hamstrings, you're probably not going to be able to get your leg all the way up. That's okay. It does not matter how far you sweep forward. What does matter is that you keep your hips stable when the leg sweeps. So not stable would look something like this. See, I let my hips come forward, I sank into my belly. That allowed for a lot of range of motion in my leg, but I'm not holding up the integrity of the position. So you keep the hips completely stacked, you keep the range small, and this part's really important. As the leg sweeps forward, think about making the rest of the body lighter. You do not actually have to lift off the floor, but we're gonna remind ourselves of that side plank technique by engaging through the bottom of the oblique and through the center of the belly. This is going to make that leg series feel like safer, a little more contained, and will ensure that you're keeping the proper form the entire time.